The house was unusually quiet that evening, with the mellow amber glow from the living room light casting tiny shadows on the wooden walls, creating a homey yet somehow bleak mood. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, my trembling fingers trying to pull up the zipper of my pale blue silk dress. A wedding present from my mother for reasons I couldn't understand. But no matter how hard I tried, it was firmly stuck halfway. I let out a long sigh and looked around the room, looking for another solution. My husband Daniel had left earlier, and the only other person in the house that I ever thought I would need to turn to for assistance was my father-in-law Matthew. I walked out to the living room, where the dim lighting made everything seem more distant than usual. Matthew was sitting in his usual spot on the large armchair, his eyes focused intently on the pages of a thick book. And when he heard my footsteps, he looked up. His expression was calm but slightly perplexed. "Where's Daniel, Dad?" "He just went out. Most likely to get some groceries," I said, my voice faltering a little with embarrassment. His tone was warm and steady as usual. I bit my lip and stood there for a moment before I plucked up the courage to say, "Dad, my dress zipper is stuck. Could you help me with it?" I tried to remain calm, but my heart was thumping so loudly that it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Matthew's hands were strong but careful, resting on the zipper. "It seems the fabric's caught in the zipper," he said, his voice deep and a little rough. His brows lifted slightly in surprise, but he put his book down on the table and rose from his chair. "Of course. Come here. Let me take a look." I turned my back to him, feeling his presence close behind me, his breath lightly brushing the nape of my neck. The silky fabric of the dress slipped off my body and pooled around my feet in an instant, leaving a heavy emptiness between us in the room that seemed to freeze in that moment. I felt him gently tug at the zipper, but immediately it slid downward far more forcefully than either of us had anticipated. Matthew's face was frozen, his expression one of shock and bewilderment. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. His hands rose slightly as if to catch the fallen dress, but he quickly let them fall again. Flustered, I bent down, hurriedly grabbing the dress and wrapping it clumsily around myself. My heart continued to race wildly. "It's fine, Dad. Really. The zipper just slipped." That's all. I tried to sound calm, but my voice wavered, and I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. Matthew stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. After a long moment, he turned and walked away from the room without another word. I remained standing there, the silence in the living room oppressive and suffocating. My chest tightened with a wave of emotion I couldn't quite name, part shame, part confusion, and part something far deeper than the stillness of the space around me felt deafening, and yet I knew with stark clarity that something had shifted irrevocably between us. Things would never be the same again after that strange incident. I couldn't shake off the lingering feeling of unease. Though the event itself lasted only a fleeting moment, its effects lingered much longer than I had expected. To calm myself, I tried to think back to the life I once knew when everything felt peaceful and reassuring. I thought about my little family, a place I once believed was perfect, where the relationships between each member seemed to symbolize connection and love. I am 29 years old and have been married to Daniel, the man I deeply love, for 3 years. Daniel is warm, funny, and a reliable pillar of support. Our marriage, at least until this point, had been almost flawlessly. We lived in a spacious home in a quiet suburban neighborhood with large windows that allowed natural light to flood every corner of the house. Both of us had stable jobs, and our financial situation was secure enough for us to live comfortably without worrying about the future. Aside from the two of us, my father-in-law Matthew also lived in the house. He had moved in after Daniel's mother passed away 4 years ago. Matthew is a man I greatly respect. At 65, he still exudes a calm demeanor and the wisdom of someone who has weathered life storms. To me, he is more than just a father-in-law. He is a trusted mentor and confidant with his composed and insightful nature. Matthew often stepped into the role of mediator whenever Daniel and I had disagreements. In most of our arguments revolved around the subject of children. Daniel deeply wanted us to have a complete family, with the laughter of children filling the house. But I wasn't ready. I wanted to focus on my career, to establish myself further, before taking on the role of motherhood. Each argument left me feeling guilty for not meeting Daniel's wishes. But every time Matthew would step in with his calm, Thoughtful advice always managing to bring a sense of balance to our conflicts. Family is about listening and understanding one another. Matthew would often say in his composed tone, any problem can be resolved as long as we don't forget that love is what truly matters. His words always brought me a sense of peace after each argument. Daniel and I would sit quietly together, staring at the distant sky through the large living room windows, and the tension between us would gradually melt away. I used to believe with all my heart that my life would always follow this warm, steady rhythm, a cycle of love and connection that felt unbreakable. But sometimes the things we hold closest are the ones that can hurt us the most. Those words always brought me a sense of relief after each argument. Daniel and I would sit together, gazing out at the vast expanse of sky through the window, and all the tension would slowly dissolve. I used to think that my life would always remain this way, warm, comforting cycle revolving around love and familial connection. But perhaps the things I believed in most could also be the very things that had the potential to hurt me the deepest. I vividly remember the peaceful mornings in this house. Daniel was usually the first to wake up, brewing a steaming cup of black coffee before heading to work. I would follow shortly after, preparing a cup of tea and a simple breakfast. Then there was Matthew, always appearing with a newspaper in hand. Sometimes he would share amusing anecdotes from his time in the military, lighthearted stories that often made us laugh. At the sound of our laughter, mixed with the comforting aroma of toasted bread, created an atmosphere where it felt like all the good things in the world existed in that moment. But not everything was perfect. My love for Daniel was real and unwavering, but I couldn't deny the subtle gaps that sometimes existed between us. My career ambitions occasionally left Daniel feeling as though I wasn't putting our family first. Meanwhile, his patient but persistent desire to have children weighed heavily on me, creating a pressure I couldn't escape. In the midst of all these struggles, Matthew was always there, a calm and steady presence of the mediator who helped restore balance when it seemed out of reach. My father-in-law was the kind of person who was easy to love. He never forced his opinions on anyone or tried to impose his will. Instead, he offered gentle, thoughtful advice that allowed us to arrive at our own conclusions. I once believed that nothing in the world could ever damage the bond between him and our family. But what I never anticipated was how one incident in the living room could possess the power to change everything. The familiar images of a warm, close-knit family played vividly in my mind, as though I was desperately clinging to them. Yet the harder I tried to hold on, the more fragile those images, because I found myself questioning how I ended up in this situation. Had things started shifting long before, and I had simply failed to notice? I couldn't deny that this family had once been my sanctuary, a place that gave me an unshakable sense of safety and comfort. But now that sense of safety had been deeply shaken. What had happened between Matthew and me didn't just hurt me. It threatened to unravel the delicate balance of everything Daniel and I had built together. What could I possibly do to protect everything I cherished? At that moment, the answer was unclear. It loomed large in my heart, an unresolved void that left me grasping for clarity and struggling to find a way forward. That night, after reflecting on the peaceful memories of my family, I tried to convince myself that the incident with Matthew was nothing more than an accident. I repeated over and over in my mind that it would pass, that he had no intention beyond simply helping me. But no matter how hard I tried, those moments lingered like an inescapable shadow in my thoughts. I began to wonder, was I overreacting? Or had I missed some subtle signal that should never have existed? The next morning, everything in the house seemed to carry on as usual. Daniel had left for work early, and I was getting ready to head out to the office. As well as I walked down the stairs, I saw Matthew sitting in his familiar armchair, a cup of tea on the table, and the book he had been reading lying open beside it. He glanced up at me briefly and gave a small nod in greeting. I replied with a faint, forced smile, silently praying that he wouldn't bring up the previous night's events. I hurried out of the house and jumped right into work, hoping to drown out the tumultuous emotions churning inside of me. However, I was unable to focus throughout the day because every time I looked at my computer screen, the image of Matthew's face flashed in my mind. It was a frustrating feeling, like a sharp thorn stuck in my mind, persistently gnawing at my tranquility. That evening, when I got home, I did everything I could to make sure no one noticed anything out of the ordinary. I busied myself in the kitchen preparing dinner, focusing intently on the smallest details, slicing onions into even pieces, seasoning every dish with painstaking precision. Daniel arrived home shortly after, and as always, he helped me set the table. The three of us sat down for dinner chatting casually about small, inconsequential things. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But I could sense a subtle yet undeniable shift in Matthew's gaze when he looked at me after dinner. I washed the dishes and tidied up as usual. Daniel, looking exhausted after a long day, went upstairs earlier than he normally would have left alone in the kitchen. I tried to delay leaving by cleaning every corner, scrubbing every surface, as if prolonging my time there would shield me from what I feared. I was afraid to walk through the living room, afraid of encountering Matthew again in the suffocating silence of that space. But in the end, avoidance was futile. As I stepped out of the kitchen, Matthew was still sitting there, the warm yellow light of the room accentuating the deep lines of his weathered face. He wasn't looking at his book, nor was he looking at me. Instead, he seemed lost in his own thoughts, staring into the distance with an intensity that felt heavy in me. As I walked past his chair, my steps quickly aiming to retreat to the safety of my bedroom upstairs. But then his voice broke through the quiet, soft yet firm enough to make me freeze in place. "Leah," he called my name, his voice low and deliberate. A surge of uneasiness rose in my chest as I turned to face him and asked, "May I speak to you for a moment?" "Yes, Dad. Tell me what it is." I hesitated for a time before complying and sitting down when he indicated for me to do so on the chair across from him. Matthew looked intently into my eyes, as though he was trying to find something in me for which I should apologize last night. He started off in a serious but not insincere way, saying, "I hope it didn't upset you. It was just an unfortunate accident." I nodded slowly, uncertain of what to say. His words were well chosen, and although they should have soothed me, I could still feel the tension in the room. I nodded while trying to speak steadily. "I understand, Dad. It's nothing really. There's no need to worry about it." He remained silent for a while before continuing, but I felt like something had changed between us since yesterday. "Do you agree?" I was completely taken aback by his question, which was like a punch to the chest. I was unsure of how to react, and I stammered, "I think everything's fine, Dad. Maybe I'm just a little tired. Work has been overwhelming lately." Matthew stared at me for a while, his gaze carrying something I couldn't quite define. "If you ever feel uncomfortable about anything, please tell me," he said, turning his face away as if he wanted to end the conversation. I got up and quickly made my way upstairs. But that night I couldn't sleep because his words kept coming back to me. Could he sense something the way I did? Normally, I had been working so hard to keep up a thin, fragile facade that was ready to break at any moment. In the days that followed, I tried my best to avoid Matthew as much as possible. I could have left for work earlier, returned home later, and spent most of my time upstairs instead of in the common areas of the house. However, the more I tried to avoid him, the more acutely I was aware of his presence, because every time we crossed paths, I could feel his eyes on me, not the father-in-law's gaze on his daughter-in-law, but something else entirely. A week went by, and things seemed to settle down. I told myself that I was probably overanalyzing it. But when Daniel had to leave for an unforeseen work trip on a Saturday morning, I found myself alone in the house with Matthew. At that point, nothing could be concealed. I woke up feeling exhausted and lethargic, so I went downstairs to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea with the intention of resting all day. When I entered the living room, Matthew was there as usual, but this time his eyes followed me around every move. "Leah, do you feel ill?" I nodded and forced a feeble smile as he questioned in a worried tone. "Yes, just a slight fever, Dad. Nothing serious," I said. He got up and came over to me. "Are you in need of anything? I can buy you some medicine or cook you some soup." But I automatically moved away to put some distance between us. "Don't you think?" "I'm grateful, Dad. I'm all right. I think I'll just go upstairs and take a short break." But before I could move forward, Matthew interrupted me with a statement that I never would have expected to hear from Leah since that day. The room froze, and when I turned to look at him, the expression in his eyes had changed. The familiar one. I knew it was a different intensity, unsettling, and I felt as though the walls around us were closing in, squeezing the air out of my lungs. "Dad," I managed to say, my voice trembling. But I couldn't hide it anymore. He continued, his voice shaky but full of determination. And I stood there frozen, unsure of how to react. This moment had gone beyond any boundaries I could have imagined. And the only clear and urgent thought running through my mind was that I needed to leave the situation right away. From that point on, our relationship was never the same. Even though I tried to convince myself that Matthew's words that day were just a brief moment of weakness, something he didn't really mean. The tension in the air between us was undeniable every time we found ourselves in the same room. And I could feel an unsaid strain simmering beneath the surface, as though an invisible wall between us was growing taller but somehow less stable. I tried my best to maintain an air of normalcy every morning. I still woke up on time, prepared breakfast and ate with Daniel before he left for work. But whenever Matthew walked into the kitchen, my entire body would stiffen. I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes instead, focusing intently on the steaming cup of tea in front of me, as though the rising warmth could somehow mask the unease flooding my mind. Matthew rarely said much. He would usually sit quietly in his chair, sip his tea, and occasionally flip through the pages of his newspaper. But his silence only made me more anxious. Sometimes when I failed to avoid his gaze in time, I would catch his eyes lingering on me. There was something in them that I couldn't quite define, conflict, pain, or perhaps something even deeper, something I didn't dare to name. As time went on, I realized I couldn't keep avoiding him forever. I tried every possible way to escape the situation, staying out late after work, keeping as much physical distance as I could when at home, and even attempting to persuade Daniel that we should move out and live on our own. But every time I brought it up, Dee would only smile and dismiss the idea, insisting it wasn't necessary. We've been doing just fine here, haven't we? He would say in his tone filled with certainly Dad's getting older. And I don't want him to feel lonely. I couldn't argue with him. I knew how much Daniel loved his father and how deeply he valued their relationship, and because of that, I couldn't bring myself to reveal even the slightest hint of what was truly weighing on me. Why, one evening when Daniel had to stay late at work, I found myself alone in the house with Matthew. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks had finally reached a boiling point. I sat in the living room, the television on, but my attention far from it. The sound of Matthew's steady, deliberate footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, sending a tightening sensation through my chest. My heart raced as I heard him approach, each step a reminder of the growing unease that had become a permanent fixture in my life. He walked into the living room carrying a cup of tea in his hand. When he saw me sitting there, he paused, his eyes flickering with hesitation before he decided to move closer. "Leah," he said, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable seriousness. I looked up, doing my best to maintain a calm facade. "Yes, Dad. Do you need something?" He put the tea on the table and sat in the chair opposite from me. Unlike normal, he looked me in the eyes and didn't cover anything. "Do you need to talk?" "You don't need to say anything more, Dad." I tried to interrupt him, but he shook his head. He started off by saying, "I know it made you feel uncomfortable, and I felt the same way, but I need you to understand something." I swallowed hard, feeling like my entire body was pinned to the chair. "No, I must say this because if I don't, I will never be at peace. I don't remember when this began." But I went silent as the tension in the room increased like a storm about to erupt. His final words caught me off guard. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a conflict in my heart, something I couldn't control. Matthew wasn't just a man caught in an inappropriate web of emotions. He was someone battling himself against feelings he'd never wanted. "Dad, you shouldn't say these things," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm your daughter-in-law. This isn't right." "Not even a little," he went on, regretful. "But ever since that day, I've been unable to stop thinking about you every time I see you, and I feel things I should never feel." His words cut through the air like a sharp blade, leaving me breathless and wanting to get up and flee. But my legs felt frozen, unwilling to move. The room seemed to whirl around me as he nodded, his eyes clouded with grief. "I know," he said, "and I tried to put an end to this, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I didn't want you to bear this burden alone. I can't keep living like this." I said, my voice firmer than it had been in weeks. "I'm going to talk to Daniel." We need to move out. It's the only way. Matthew didn't say anything. He only lowered his head as though accepting the truth of my words. I walked out of the room. My heart weighed down like never before. I knew this wasn't just about my relationship with him. It had the potential to impact the entire family, but I had no choice. I had to do this to protect everything I loved. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside me, and wondered if he could ever forgive me if he knew the full truth. But I also knew that no matter how things had turned out, I couldn't endure this torment for another second after a sleepless night. I knew I couldn't let things drag on any longer. This house, this family. Everything was slowly sinking into a quagmire that neither Matthew nor I should have ever stepped into. I looked at Daniel, still sound asleep beside me, his steady breaths filling the quiet room. He was the man who loved me, who trusted me completely, and that trust only made the weight on my chest heavier. As the morning light filtered through the curtains, I asked myself if he would ever understand and forgive if he knew the truth, or if everything would fall apart and never be the same again. I decided to protect Daniel and to protect this family. Even though the thought broke my heart, I knew that severing this tangled thread was the only way to prevent things from getting worse, even if it meant losing a piece of the life I once loved. That morning at breakfast, I tried to keep things as normal as possible. Daniel smiled as he sipped his first cup of coffee, asking me about my plans for the day. As he always did, I smiled back and gave him a light-hearted response. But inside, I was getting ready to say what I needed to say. I waited for Matthew to enter the kitchen, and when he did his eyes briefly flicker over me? Before settling elsewhere, I wasn't sure if he had sensed my resolve, but I no longer had the luxury to care after Daniel left for work. I walked into the living room where Matthew sat reading the newspaper. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as they held the paper. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to." He set the newspaper down and looked at me with a neutral expression, though I could feel the turmoil hidden behind his calm facade. "Go ahead," he replied, his voice rough and low. "I've made my decision," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm going to talk to Daniel. We need to move out. It's the only way to protect all of us." Matthew's eyes widened briefly in surprise, but then he nodded as though he had already anticipated this outcome. "I understand," he said, his voice softening. "If that's what you need to do, I won't stop you. I only hope that you'll be happy and that Daniel will be too." His words made my throat tighten with emotion. As far as things had gone, I knew Matthew wasn't a bad person. He was a complicated man trapped in a web of emotions he never wanted. But I couldn't let my sympathy waver. My resolve that night, when Daniel came home, I had the conversation I had dreaded. I couldn't tell him the whole truth, but I explained that I needed space, that living with his father had become overwhelming for me at first. Daniel resisted. He didn't understand why I had changed so suddenly, but the determination in my eyes silenced him in the end. He agreed. A few weeks later, we moved into a small apartment in the city. On the day we left, I couldn't bring myself to meet Matthew's eyes. I knew he was standing at the window watching us from the living room, but I didn't look back. It was the only choice I had to present. Observe what little remained of this family. As time passed, I worked to rebuild my life, focusing on my relationship with Daniel and the love we had nurtured. But deep inside, the memories of that house, of Matthew's gaze, continued to haunt me. It was a hard lesson, one that taught me that closeness and trust can sometimes become double-edged swords if boundaries are not respected. I lost a great deal to learn this, but at least I managed to hold on to what mattered most to my family, and know that from now on I will never allow myself to make the same mistake again.